Good day. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to start this video with a bleak piece of news that relates to myself. Some of you who have been following this channel may remember that back in the summer, I was having to make various statements and give warnings about a multiplicity of channels that were appearing on YouTube purporting to be connected to myself in some manner. And I had to explain that none of these channels was in fact connected to me in any way at all, and that these channels should be completely disregarded. Well, I'm glad to say that that problem abated over the course of the summer. It seems that YouTube, and no doubt following lots of complaints from members of the community, from people like yourselves, anyway, YouTube gradually cleaned up all of these fake channels which purported to be myself, and which, to say again, had nothing to do with me at all. Well, unfortunately, it now seems that whoever was behind the YouTube channels, or perhaps someone else, anyway, the same thing is now happening, this time on Telegram. Apparently there's a whole cluster of Telegram channels, all purporting to be either myself or connected to myself in some form. And let me repeat again, there is only one Telegram channel that I have any connection with at all, and that is the one that the Duran runs. No other channel, certainly no channel that has my name, has any connection to me whatsoever. They're all fake, they're all scams of various kinds, criminal scams, I should make clear. I've seen that in one case, somebody was contacted purportedly by someone from one of these channels, presumably pretending to be me, claiming that this person had won a prize, which was an expensive electric guitar. I'm sure there will be all kinds of other angles related to these channels. But let me reiterate again, they have nothing to do with me. They're cases of identity theft. They're undoubtedly criminal enterprises out to make money based on the work that the Duran does, that I do, that the community, all of us do together, because every single one of you is a part of this community. Somebody, as I said, is trying to cash in on that and doing this in an entirely criminal way. So please have nothing to do with these channels, these Telegram channels, which are now appearing on Telegram. We at the Duran are going to do what we can to alert the authorities at Telegram to the existence of these bogus channels. If the pattern with YouTube reproduces itself, eventually Telegram will get round to clearing them. It may take some time, but in the meantime, if you see anything like this, any channel that purports to be me on Telegram and which is not the channel, the one channel that is connected to myself, which is the Duran channel on Telegram, well, please have absolutely nothing to do with it. Certainly don't communicate with anybody there. Don't, for heaven's sake, give any information, certainly not your address, which I've known in one case somebody was asked. Certainly give none of your bank or credit card details or anything of that kind. It is a criminal scam, and if you can find the time and the means to report it to Telegram, well, I am grateful. I am very sorry to have to give this information right at the start of a program like the one I'm doing today. I can only apologize. Unfortunately, it does seem, as I said, that some people seem to think that the best way that they can make money is at our collective expense. Thank you for that, and let me now move on with my program today. And my program today, again, is going to start with the situation in Ukraine, though the situation in the Middle East is becoming, or so it seems to me, increasingly dangerous once more. But let me start, first of all, with the situation in Ukraine. And I'm going to come back to that topic, which I've covered now several times in recent programs, which is the aftermath, or rather the consequences, of those enormous missile and drone strikes that the Russians launched on the 29th of December and on the 2nd of January. And we're now beginning to get more and more satellite evidence and other evidence giving some sense of the enormous amount of damage that has been done. Now, I have not been able to collect this information, and I've gone to the Russian Ministry of Defense website, and for the moment at least their English language versions are not providing a detailed breakdown of the damage that the Russian authorities claim to have done. But we are getting lots of information from other sources, from satellites, from pictures that have been made illegally, by the way, by people. There's some suggestions that the Russians have managed to hack into the CCTV cameras that exist in Kiev. Very likely true, by the way, and that the Russians are using these cameras to be able to observe the situation in Kiev and to keep track of the damage that the drone and missile strike has done. But anyway, we're now starting to see a growing accumulation of information. And some of this includes, as I said, satellite photos, which are not really open to challenge, or so it seems to me. And they show huge damage. There's one factory, I've heard it suggested that this is the Artyom factory, which builds rockets for multiple launch rocket systems. There's one factory, you can see this large factory building, massive smoke, a huge hole in the roof. The damage seems to have been catastrophic, and it's been suggested that this particular factory might have been targeted by 2 or perhaps even 3 Kinzhals, in which case clearly those did in fact get through if they were actually Kinzhals. But that's just one factory, and I understand that there's now an accumulation of evidence which all of which taken together suggests huge damage, even greater than the damage I spoke about in my program yesterday. And there's some reports circulating that as many as 9 Ukrainian generals were killed in these attacks, including a senior officer of the Ukrainian High Command, somebody very close to Zelensky himself. I would stress that claim is uncorroborated, but it does seem as if a Patriot missile battery was at least significantly damaged, and that there was more destruction done to other air defense batteries, IRIS-Ts and NASAMs and whatever. So this looks like it was a devastating strike, and the early reports that at some point over the course of the strike, the entire air defense system in Kiev basically collapsed. It basically seized up. It got overwhelmed by the degree of the incoming barrage. Well, it's now increasingly looking as if that was true. And by the way, we're also getting lots of reports about damage being done right across Ukraine by other Russian missile strikes that took place both on that day and on other days. The Russians, of course, are not just striking at Kiev, but the particular focus of this latest big strike does seem to have been on Kiev itself. And I spoke in my program yesterday about the increasing alarm about this in the West. And in fact, we got yet another indicator about this. And this is an announcement, if it is exactly an announcement, anyway, statements, comments that European Union officials have now agreed to try and buy 1,000 Patriot missiles to send to replenish their own arsenals and to send to Ukraine, and that they're searching for ways to create a Patriot missile production line within the territory of the European Union itself. Now, of course, the latter is going to take a very long time to set up. Factories like that cannot be created in a day or a week or even a couple of weeks. We're looking at a production facility that would take at least some months, optimistically, more likely years to get going. But anyway, that is some indications that there's been alarm across the European Union. There's now apparently a hunt for Patriot missiles to send to Ukraine. As I've discussed in the past, Patriot missiles, Brian Beletic has provided all the details here. Patriot missiles generally are in short supply around the world. And of course, the batteries, the missile batteries, are getting hit. And this does seem to be confirmed in this case. And the damage that is being done to Kiev is very substantial. And worse, I would say, that anything that we have seen since the initial weeks of the special military operation, when the Russians also were targeting industrial facilities in Kiev on a sustained basis, though at that time Kiev's air defense system, based as it was principally on the Soviet era S-300 missile system, appears to have been rather more resilient than it is looking like today. Now, I don't know how many more assaults of this kind the Russians intend to carry out. Maybe they will take stock and decide that sufficient damage has been done for the moment, but it is quite likely that they will be striking back at Kiev again and in other places in Ukraine before very long. And this morning, more reports that the mobile phone system in Kiev and in Ukraine generally has been hacked, that the Kiev Star, the major mobile phone operator, is struggling in the face of these sustained hacking attacks. Again, there are claims that these attacks have been carried out by various private groups in Russia. My own view is that these attacks are undoubtedly being organized and orchestrated by the Russian authorities, and it looks as if the Russians are becoming more effective in these cyber attacks on Ukraine's mobile phone and internet system. And it's likely that these attacks will intensify and grow. Now, before I move on from this topic, I should say that one particular plant, the factory, the Artyom factory, which I think may have been the one which has been captured in this satellite picture with, the great hole in the roof and the smoke billowing out and all of this. Well, a former worker of the Artyom factory, allegedly, anyway, this person has contacted Boris Rozhin, as I understand it, the person who publishes as Colonel Kassad. I've discussed how he's one of the most interesting and reliable and insightful reporters and analysts of the war from the Russian side. And one should stress very much from the Russian side. Anyway, there's a report attributed to this person. Again, I should make it clear, I don't know the antecedents of this person. But anyway, which claims that up to 50 people might have been killed or injured in this attack on this particular factory. Presumably, these were factory workers operating in this armaments factory. Now, again, I want to stress this is a rumor. There is no corroboration of this. The attack apparently happened early in the morning when the first shift, presumably, was starting work. It seems that because of the disruption of the metro system in Kiev, some workers didn't arrive at the factory, and they're the ones that were not affected. But it does look as if, or at least according to this report, it seems that a large number of people were killed or injured in this attack. Now, there is no reporting of this in the Ukrainian media. There is no reporting of this particular incident in the Western media either. To repeat again what I said yesterday, the Ukrainian Defense Ministry, on the contrary, is suggesting that the entire assault on Kiev, this missile and drone assault, was a failure, that all of the Kinzhals were shot down and all of the Kh-101 missiles were shot down, and that some ballistic missiles got through, but none of the cruise missiles and none of the drones got through. Well, as I said, the photographic evidence already appears to refute that claim, and more reports we're getting from the ground appear to be refuting this claim also. Now, maybe this story about all of these killed or injured production line workers at the Artyom plant are wrong. I would like to believe so. But of course, if they are true, then rumors of this are going to start circulating in Kiev, even despite whatever attempts the Ukrainian authorities make to try to still these rumors. And besides, it's difficult to believe that people in Kiev are completely unaware of the enormous damage that has been done as a result of this missile and drone attack. And I say this because today there's an article which has appeared in the New York Times, which appears to say that people in Ukraine are starting to become increasingly skeptical about the information that they're getting from their government. And the title of the article, I'm not going to read the article, but the article says it's state propaganda. Ukrainians shun TV news as war drags on. A government-approved news program intended to counter Russian disinformation and boost morale is coming under criticism for painting a rosy picture of the war. And I am not surprised, to be frank, that things like this are starting to happen. The Ukrainian government has, perhaps unsurprisingly, been working hard over the last couple of years, ever since the conflict began, to create as optimistic a picture of the war as possible. But the realities are starting to break through. Too many people have been killed in the war. Too many people have been wounded. There's far too many pictures of cemeteries expanding across Ukraine. I've discussed that in the past. There's too much evidence of economic damage to the country. Too many people are involved in the army. There have been opinion polls which show that lots of people in Ukraine, a large majority of people in Ukraine, now know somebody who has been killed or wounded in the fighting. This accumulation of bad news is discrediting the government's attempts to continue to project an optimistic picture of the war through its television channels, which it controls. And of course, in any war, the single most important place is the capital. If people in the capital start to have doubts that the war is going well, that can have much greater political consequences than is the case if people start having doubts in some outlying village or even town or city in one of the far-flung regions. And that, I think, is uncontroversial, and it has been a historically founded fact in many wars. But specifically, if we're talking about Kiev, if it is indeed the case that people have been killed in these missile strikes, more people have been killed in these missile and drone strikes than the Ukrainian government is admitting, if industrial facilities, as we know, have indeed been damaged, if there's been damage to the air defense system, significant damage done to the air defense system, if all of this is happening at the same time as the mobile phone system is out of order because the Russians are successfully hacking it, then of course that will further explain why people are starting to lose confidence in the information they're getting from the television media. And of course, the particular cynicism will increase in Kiev itself. Now, Kiev, the Ukrainian government has worked very hard ever since the first weeks of the war, when the Russians were briefly camped outside Kiev. In fact, one Russian motorized column actually advanced quite deep into Kiev at one point early in the war, in the first 2 weeks of the war, though it suffered heavy losses and was quickly withdrawn. But anyway, since that time, since the Russians withdrew from the environs of Kiev at the end of March 2022, the Ukrainian government has worked extremely hard to preserve, to the best extent that it can, a feeling that Kiev itself is protected, that life there is continuing as normal. Now, there have been shocks over the course of last winter. For example, there were all the attacks on the energy system, which were having an effect on conditions of life in Kiev itself. But then, of course, the Russian missile strikes last winter came directly after the successful Ukrainian offensives in Kharkiv and Kherson region, and at a time when there was lots of optimistic talk about the coming Ukrainian offensive, and at a time when the Western powers were coming together and were busy supplying Ukraine with armored vehicles, with Leopard 2 tanks and Challenger 2 tanks and Abrams tanks and Bradleys and Marders and lots of types of howitzers and all of those kind of things. So even though Ukraine was suffering knocks, Kiev was suffering knocks last winter, there was other news that could continue to buoy optimism, to sustain morale. At a time when Ukraine has had the experience of its great offensive of the summer, end in defeat, following information from the battlefronts, which must be dribbling through and which points to a deteriorating situation on the battlefronts. Missile strikes like this on Kiev are inevitably going to worsen morale there, and of course deepen skepticism about the information that the government itself is providing. I think that in wars, sometimes it is better for governments to be more truthful with their people about what is actually happening than it is to continue to give a rosy picture which more and more people begin to doubt. And the New York Times article points to the fact that as belief in the news that Ukrainians are getting from their television declines, so does trust in the Ukrainian government and in the overall in the other institutions that make up Ukraine. Anyway, major Russian missile strike. And of course, all of this is taking place as there continues to be an accumulation of bad news on the battlefronts. Now, again, we remain in the period between the New Year holiday and the Russian Orthodox Christmas, which, by the way, is on Sunday, not Saturday, as I mistakenly said yesterday. And, of course, I should say that there are still ongoing rumors that President Putin is intending to announce a brief Christmas truce, though, as I've said previously, it is most unlikely that the Ukrainians will comply, will agree with that truce. But anyway, those reports are circulating that that is coming. But as a result of the fact that we are in what is a holiday period, I suspect we are continuing to get less information from the battlefronts. But what information we are getting is bleak for Ukraine. Now, it seems to me that there are three big battles taking place. One is in and around Avdiivka, and there was reports this morning that the Russians have made further advances in the town of Pervomaisky, which, well, small village of Pervomaisky, which is to the southwest of Avdiivka. Well, actually, it's a little bit further up, the Sac, if you like. The Russians seem to be, after a certain hiatus, resuming their attack in that direction, and that they're launching more attacks deeper into Avdiivka from the south into Avdiivka itself, and that they seem to be gradually working towards, moving towards the center of Avdiivka, that they've still got some way to go before that happens. So there were those reports. There's fewer reports about what's happening in other parts of the Avdiivka battlefronts, but the last reasonably reliable reports that I got was of further Russian advances up the railway system towards Ocheretinye. I think I've got the name of that village correct, the big village to the north of Avdiivka, which apparently lies on higher ground and which is on the railway line, and which the Russians seem to be working towards capturing. And, of course, there's also continued big encounter battles going on around Stepovoye. So, a slow, steady deterioration of Ukrainian positions around Avdiivka, and a continued big Russian push in the Marinka area, working towards the gradual capture of this important village of Novomikhailovka, of gradually cracking the remaining Ukrainian defenses near Marinka itself having been captured. Again, the Russians incrementally working with their forces to try to improve their positions there. But it seems that the most dramatic information now is definitely coming from Bakhmut. Bakhmut, by the way, has been by several orders of magnitude the focal point of the most intense fighting for the most prolonged period during this war. The battle for Bakhmut began in November 2022. It resulted in the Russian capture of Bakhmut in May 2023. The Ukrainians then launched a counterattack in May 2023, seeking to recapture either the whole of Bakhmut or at least the western part of Bakhmut, west of the Bakhmutki Canal. That Ukrainian counterattack, which is extremely costly in men and machines, like every part of the battle of Bakhmut has been. Anyway, it eventually ebbed in the autumn. Since then, gradually, the Russians have been on the attack. They captured Khromovo a few weeks ago. They're in the process of capturing more and more of Bogdanovka. They seem to be advancing in other places, on the northern flanks of Bakhmut and to the west of Bakhmut. There was a big Ukrainian counterattack that was launched in this area to the west of Bakhmut, to the northwest of Bakhmut a couple of days ago. There were some reports that the Ukrainians had regained some ground as a result of that counterattack. That information has now been refuted. It seems that the counterattack was a complete failure. All that resulted in was very, very heavy losses suffered by the Ukrainians. And over the course of the last few hours, there's been more reports that the Russians have gradually tightened their grip on Bogdanovka, gained a lot more territory south of Bogdanovka and west of Bakhmut, are now very close to Chasov Yar, that they're not attacking that place itself, and that the fighting in Bakhmut, both in the northwest and from the southwest, in the areas of Kordumovka and Klishevka and along a railway line that exists there, that the fighting is going very badly for the Ukrainians. And, well, Dima, in one of his recent programs at the Military Summary Channel, even spoke about the Ukrainian positions in the northwest of Bakhmut collapsing, though I suspect that's probably a bit of an overstatement at this time. But anyway, an extremely difficult situation for the Ukrainians in Bakhmut. And here perhaps I should correct a misconception that I myself had. I've often said that I have very great difficulty reading maps, and I have referred in the past to a canal, and I've assumed, and this has been obvious from some of my programs, that this canal is located to the west of Chasov Yar. Well, in his latest video on the Military Summary Channel, Dima clarified for me, I'm sure an awful lot of you have known this all along, precisely where this canal is. It actually lies to the east of Chasov Yar. In other words, it is between Chasov Yar and Bakhmut. But anyway, it does look as if the Russians are gradually, steadily moving closer and closer to this canal line. And Dima at the Military Summary Channel has made the point that the canal, once the Russians have reached it, once they've taken Ivanivska and Bogdanovka and fully cleared Klesheyevka and all of the rest, that the canal makes a natural defensive barrier. And in fact, I've heard this explained many times. I recall that at the time of Ukraine's counterattack in Bakhmut, there were suggestions that the reason that the Ukrainians were able to launch a counterattack around Bakhmut at all was because the Wagner forces pulled out from Bakhmut in May, and that the job had not yet been fully finished, that Bogdanovka, Khromovo, and Ivanivska had not been captured, and that the Russians really needed to reach the canal in order to stabilize the front line at Bakhmut. Anyway, the Russians do seem to be working now towards reaching that canal. Now, what they're going to do beyond that is, of course, a completely different matter. And here I should say that Dima, as he sometimes does, came up with a very interesting, and I think on this one he might actually be right, an interesting suggestion that in fact, once they reach the canal, the Russians might not actually cross the canal to take Chasov Yar. Rather, they're more likely to advance north along the east bank of the canal. Ultimate objective being to cut off and eventually capture the town of Siversk to the north, and gradually to get close to Liman again. The Russians are pushing hard towards Liman from positions further north, in other words, to straighten their lines in this area. Eventually capture Liman, and at that point reactivate their advance towards Kupiansk, which my sense is that the Russians having got very close to Kupiansk, they've somewhat stood down there in recent weeks as the focus has been more on Bakhmut and on Avdiivka. But anyway, once Liman is recaptured, the Russians would then reactivate their front around Liman. They would capture Siversk as well, this town which they failed to capture in the summer of 2022, directly after the capture of Lysychansk. Many people, including Dima, by the way, at the military summary channel, thought that they would prioritize its capture, but in the event they didn't. But anyway, capture Siversk, capture Liman, capture Kupiansk itself, move on towards capturing Izium, west of the Oskol River, in other words, returning to all the territory that the Russians ceded during Ukraine's counteroffensive of the autumn. And then, of course, bring Slavyansk, the northern part of the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk conurbation, into a sort of semicircle, and finally start the offensive towards Slavyansk that appeared at one time to have been the Russian plan in the summer of 2022, following the capture of Lysychansk, but which the Russians abandoned when it became clear that the Ukrainians were going to be launching counteroffensives in Kharkiv and Kherson region, and that the Russians needed to build up defenses and to move over to a more defensive strategy. So, well, Dima may be right. He has sometimes tried to second guess Russian strategic plans. He hasn't always been right. None of us are. He isn't obviously informed by the Russian General Staff of what their plans are, any more than I am. But anyway, it all made a fair amount of sense to me. It would mean moving on towards Liman, perhaps eventually in conjunction with that attack towards Liman and Seversk and Kupiansk and ultimately Izium and eventually Slavyansk. Well, then at that point, maybe another Russian force might start pushing towards Chasov Yar and Konstantinovka and attacking Kramatorsk from the south. Who's to say? But anyway, it was an interesting set of plans, and for all I know, it's true. Anyway, that is all for the future. But the fact remains that the Russians are advancing. They're pushing forward very hard in the northern Donbass, in the central Donbass, around Avdiivka, in the southern Donbass, around Marinka itself. They seem to be gradually, as I've said in previous programs, incrementally increasing the pressure on the Ukrainians. And it is important again, and I've made this point many times, but I'm going to just repeat it once more. It is important to understand that the military units that are conducting these operations on the part of the Russian military are still only a fraction of the total forces that the Russians are building up and are mobilizing. There is been much talk, I've discussed it many times, about this huge Russian buildup going on. The 1,500 men that are applying to join the Russian army every day. The fact that the Russians apparently exceeded their target. They were planning to increase their army by 420,000 men in 2023. They've admitted that in fact it was more than that, perhaps 480,000 men. I have a source who says that the Russians are actually understating the true size of their build-up. I've discussed the vexed question of artillery numbers. I've spoken about the fact that the Russians also seem to be increasing production of their tanks. They've said that they're now producing 1,500 tanks. These are both entirely new build tanks and refurbished tanks, that they're building 1,500 of these every year, or building and refurbishing 1,500 tanks last year. But apparently the numbers are set to increase. There's talk that the production line of the T-80 tank in Omsk is about to restart, and that could happen as early as this year, or so it is said. And Rostec are saying that aircraft production is also rising, that there will be a much bigger delivery of Sukhoi 57 fifth generation fighters to the Russian Air Force this year as compared to last year. We don't quite know how many Sukhoi 57s have been deployed with the Russian Air Force. I've seen some reports that it's 22. Might be, there's going to be more. Who knows? Well, we'll find out. Anyway, whatever. This big Russian build-up is going on, is continuing. But the forces that are participating in these various offensives, well, some of them are new. Some of them undoubtedly are troops that have been called up and trained since the start of the special military operation, since the beginning of last year, since the beginning of January 2023. We're seeing build-ups in Kharkiv region, in Bakhmut itself, where there's said to be 80,000 Russian troops concentrated in Zaporozhye region as well. But the big divisions, the big heavy tank and mechanized divisions that are forming in Russia or have formed in Russia have still not been committed to the battle. Most of the forces in Avdiivka, are largely locally recruited men from the Donbass, people from the Donbass militia, the people who've been fighting in Zaporozhye and in Kherson region are drawn from the 58th Army, which has been participating in the conflict almost from the start. There's the Chechen fighters, there's the airborne troops, there's all of these. But the big, heavy tank and mechanized infantry forces, which briefly were engaged at the very start of the special military operation and who briefly were camped around Kiev and who occupied places like ETHEREUM at the start of the war, but which were then pulled back to Russia, where they have been built up and reinforced ever since. They have not yet been committed in bulk to the battle. And again, what the Russians plan to do with all of that, who can say? But eventually, I personally remain of the view that we are certain at some stage to see these forces committed as well, or at least part of them committed as well. And incidentally, there continues to be a lot of rumor and speculation about a big Russian offensive being planned again in the north towards Sumy and Chernigov and perhaps Kiev itself. I've discussed that this seems to be the area where the Ukrainians are concentrating in building up their fortified lines, they're laying their minefields and putting up dragon's teeth and creating pillboxes and those kind of things. And one can see why the Ukrainians might be anxious to do that. And one can also see why it might be tempting for the Russians to start to commit many of their heavy armored forces in this area. Because as has been pointed out to me by a number of people who have been emailing me, Ukraine's need to hold the line in the Donbass and on the southern fronts means that Ukraine has had to reduce the total number of troops it has in its reserves and to deploy more of its forces to the southern and eastern front lines, which potentially could leave the northern front lines, the ones around Chernigov and Sumy and ultimately Kiev itself, short of troops. And presumably, part of the purpose of this mobilization that Zelensky and Zelensky have been arguing about is to try to find more men that they can position to defend Kiev and to defend Ukraine's northern borders. But let me stress again, we can speculate at length about what the Russians might be planning to do, but they don't share their plans with us. All we can say with confidence at the moment is that the Ukrainians are taking heavy damage and that they're doing so every day, that they're continuing to suffer very, very heavy losses, that their forces are being attritioned in Bakhmut and near Marinka and in Avdiivka, and by the way, in the Zaporozhye area and along the Dnieper River, where the Russians appear to have resumed Lancet and bomb strikes on Ukrainian positions on the west bank of the Dnieper River, and of course in Krinky itself. And for the moment, that continues to be what the Russians do. They continue to wage an attrition war, weakening the Ukrainian forces and reducing both Ukraine's manpower, trained manpower, and the West's arsenals of weapons. I spoke earlier in the program about this frantic plan to increase production, or in the European Union, to find more Patriot missiles and eventually to start production of Patriot missiles. There's been a really alarmed comment in Germany from a German Green MP, fierce supporter of Ukraine, as you would expect from a German Green. He's saying that the German tanks, the Leopard 2s, they're no longer operating to any great extent. They've either been damaged or destroyed, or they've broken down. They can't operate in Ukrainian military conditions. And I've noticed that David Axe at Forbes is now asking what has happened to the Abrams tanks, the 31 Abrams tanks, which we were hearing so much about a few months ago. They haven't, so far as we can see, ever been committed to the battlefield. There's talk that the Abrams tanks simply cannot cope with Ukrainian battlefield conditions. The engines are too temperamental. They block after just 30 minutes of use. I remember Douglas McGregor and Scott Ritter and Brian Beletic all warning that this would happen. I also have seen reports that the topside armor of the Abrams, remember these are earlier versions of the Abrams tanks, they don't have the special uranium armor that those tanks in American use have, but the topside armor of these Abrams tanks that the Ukrainians have been supplied with, that it's too fragile, too thin to resist Russian Lancet strikes, Lancet drone strikes. Who's to say? But anyway, we haven't seen them. We haven't seen the Challenger 2s now for a while. Reports that up to 3 of them have been destroyed. As far as I know, the Russian Defense Ministry has only claimed 1 destroyed, but other Russian commentators are saying that as many as 3 have been destroyed. They have disappeared, so far as I can tell, from the battlefields. Maybe Ukraine is holding these tanks, these Challengers and these Abrams tanks back in reserve to try and create some kind of an armored fist around them. We've seen little use of the Leopard 1 tanks. I've always said that, many people have said, that these tanks don't seem to be well adapted to Ukrainian battlefield conditions either. Their armor is too thin, their guns are too light. But anyway, lots of problems with equipment. And I saw that in Britain, there's apparently been a decision to start manufacturing, to resume manufacturing in Northern Ireland of the M777 howitzers that the United States has donated to Ukraine. And again, the reason is not, I think, so much to replace the Ukrainian arsenal of M777s. It's that so many M777s have been exported to Ukraine that Western militaries, including the US military, are now desperately short of these guns. But again, to reiterate, one can make a decision to resume production of the M777, but actually restarting a stopped production line can take time. This is apparently a complicated gun. It uses all kinds of expensive materials. It uses a lot of titanium, for example. It might not be such a straightforward matter to put it back in production. And of course, no gun is effective without shells, and I've discussed in many programs the difficulty the West is having producing shells. So there we are. Now, I notice that increasingly now there is a new trope which has been appearing in the Western media. This is that Russia now operates entirely as a war economy, that President Putin has converted the entire Russian economy onto a wartime footing, and that what now functions in Russia is, to all intents and purposes, a war economy. And the suggestion is that this is an unsustainable thing. If the West can keep Ukraine fighting long enough, then eventually the maintenance of this Russian war economy will exhaust itself, and, well, the sanctions will then have an effect, and perhaps Ukraine might win after all. Every single commentary that has been made in the West about the Russian economy, for as long as I can remember, has been bad. And this latest claim that the Russian economy is now essentially a war economy is wrong. Now, first of all, there is no doubt at all that Russia has very considerably increased production of military equipment. I've discussed this in many programs. There is also no doubt at all that the Russians are spending an awful lot more on defense. There's some suggestions that they're spending up to 6% of their GDP on this military production surge. But 6% of GDP, even if that is the correct figure, is not a war economy in the sense that, say, the United States during the Second World War was a war economy. It would be roughly analogous to the American military spend on defense-related matters in the 1950s and early 1960s, before the Vietnam War began. And besides, as I have discussed in many programs now, understanding what is happening to the Russian economy in the West is discounting the reality that other sectors of the economy are surging as well, which is the reason, by the way, why Russia expects this year that the budget deficit will be 1.5% of GDP, as opposed to the 2% of GDP, rather, of last year, as opposed to the 2% of GDP for 2023 that had been originally penciled in. We're seeing surges in civilian production of goods. We're seeing surges in food production. There's been problems with eggs recently. The Russians are now importing eggs busily from Turkey in order to reduce prices for eggs. This became a controversial subject. Incredibly, there was even an article, I think it was in the Financial Times, focusing on the problems of eggs in Russia, which was supposed to show that the problems in the economy were spiraling out of control. I mean, very strange article. But anyway, the important thing to understand is that all the indications are that the economic surge that we have seen in Russia since the middle of 2023 has been broad-based. Now, there are problems in the Russian economy, and I've discussed them, and we discussed them at length, Alex Christoforou and I, at the Duran. There is a problem that with very low unemployment, there is no great surplus labor force. Improving productivity is going to be a tough call in such a short time. There is probably, in fact, there undoubtedly is, very considerable slack in the industrial system, probably still is, which can be used up to some extent. But ultimately, Russia is going to need more workers. And some of these workers, however difficult and embarrassing that is going to be, are going to have to be brought in from Central Asia and perhaps Iran. And we can see the first moves being made in that direction. But it is a fundamental misunderstanding to think that this is a war economy. I've now spoken to a fair number of people who have been to Russia and who've been to not just Moscow, but other places. And they all say the same thing, that there is no visible sign of stress. Prices for some goods have risen, and this has been a problem. Most people, at least in the government, expect that these prices will start to adjust and that the inflation spike will have run its course, will start to run its course next year. Well, we'll see. But again, to reiterate, this is a broad-based economic surge, and this concept that the entire economy has become a war economy in the way that, say, Britain or Germany or the United States were during the Second World War is completely wrong. Russia's economy, the Russians cannot be exhausted into defeat. If that is the thinking now, then like every other calculation the West has made throughout this crisis, based upon economics, based upon understandings of the Russian economy, that is wrong, and it is going to result in major disappointment further down the line. Given the failure of all of the sanctions, every single one of them up to this point, given the failure of the oil price cap, given all of these failures, one would have thought that by now the penny would have dropped, that the Russian economy is much bigger, far more diversified, has far more diverse trading relationships, is much better managed, has a much stronger technocratic base, has a much stronger technology sector to draw upon. By now, all of that ought to have been understood, and this mythology that Russia is this gas station masquerading as a country ought to have basically been abandoned. It is extraordinary how stubborn this belief continues to be and how enduring the errors that continue to accumulate based on this belief, how stubborn these errors still are. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say about this. Now, before I finish this roundup of Ukrainian war news, can I say that there's now been another article in the Financial Times? There's clearly a real debate underway about this question of seizing Russian assets. And this article is a much more learned article than the previous one that I discussed, which said that, let's seize these assets and call them reparations when we give them to Ukraine. This article is written by an assistant professor of history at Cornell University, and he's also, we're told, the author of The Economic Weapon, The Rise of Sanctions as a Tool of Modern War, and his name is Nicholas Mulder. And I have to say, unusually for the Financial Times, this article is one which makes, in my opinion, is entirely correct in almost every respect. It says that the push for asset confiscation, let's stick with the word confiscation. I appreciate that theft is perhaps a more accurate word of what it is. This push for asset confiscation is driven by domestic political difficulties in securing long-term funding for Kiev. As an instrument of pressure, its utility is slight. Any confiscation of reserves that have been unavailable for 2 years will not compel Putin to end his war now. I mean, that's obvious. It's astonishing that it even has to be explained. Moreover, the $227 billion current account surplus that Russia recorded in 2022, and by the way, it continued to ultimately show a current account surplus in 2023, also, though a much smaller one, has replenished a substantial share of that lost in the initial freeze. Expropriation exerts no meaningful additional economic pressure. And then he makes the absolutely key legal point. Economic reprisals are the prerogative of injured states, not of third countries. Belligerents can also expropriate public and private property belonging to their opponents' states and state and citizens. Ukraine exercised this right by seizing at least $880 million in Russian-owned property and businesses within its borders in May 2022. Yet, Kiev's allies are not at war with Russia. Belgium and France have frozen most Russian assets, holding 206 billion euros in securities in the Brussels-based depository Euroclear and other financial institutions. But to expropriate these, they would have to become a more direct party to the Russian-Ukrainian war. While one could argue that Eastern European states have been specially affected by the war's economic and military spillover effects, it is much harder to make this case for Western European countries where most Russian assets have been immobilized. And it goes on to say, the article goes on to say, when a confiscation has played a role in responding to aggression, it has sooner or later involved open war between seizers and seized. Germany lost most of its overseas property after the First World War, but seizing countries could only activate their property powers of confiscation by declaring war on the Kaiser. Another precedent is the seizure of Iraqi foreign assets to punish Saddam Hussein for his 1990 invasion of Kuwait. Yet that followed UN authorization for an international intervention to restore peace. Ukraine's allies cannot have it both ways, claiming wartime powers whilst insisting that they are not at war with Russia. So, and then of course it goes on to say, the final issue is the destabilizing precedent that Western countries would set by seizing assets to end a war they are not openly involved in. They should broaden the coercive actions that states could take for disputes to which they are not a direct party. Had the West's proposed interpretation been in effect, then Asian countries could have seized the foreign assets of any state in the US-led coalition that invaded Iraq. So, this is not only an incredibly dangerous precedent. But the only realistic way, legally speaking, that you can seize Russian assets is by declaring war on Russia. The Western powers do not want to declare war on Russia. So seizing foreign assets, seizing Russian assets, confiscating them, amounts in effect to an action which is illegal, since it cannot be done in the absence of a state of war. I would actually go further and say that seizing foreign assets in that way is an act of war which would justify, at least in theory, a Russian declaration of war on the Western powers. Now, this is absolutely obvious, and the article goes on to say, advocates of a rule-based order demolish their own credibility if they respond to Moscow's actions with illegal measures of their own. Such conduct will accelerate the dissolution of the boundary between war and peace, alienate many states outside the sanctions coalition, and dismantle the building block of the world they claim to defend. These arguments are, to my mind, legally irrefutable. And yet, as night follows day, I expect that this astonishing act of confiscation is going to happen. The pressure to do this is irresistible. I suspect that if you try to take this argument to the angry old man in the Oval Office, he will simply pay no attention. In fact, his response will be to bawl you out. And most of the people around him will do the same. And eventually, the Western powers, the other Western powers, will fall into line as well. I cannot think of any step that has been so warned against as this one, that is so clearly contrary to law as this one is, and yet I remain confident that it will be done with all of the dire consequences that people like Mr. Mulder, that it will accelerate the dissolution of the boundary between war and peace, alienate states outside the sanctions coalition, and dismantle the building block of the world the people who advocate this thing claim to defend. I'm sure that all that is right, and yet we will see it happen. So there we are. Now, this is where I end my coverage of the war in Ukraine. This is the most important war being fought out at the moment, but we see that folly continues to build on itself in other places. And of course, in the Middle East, the situation now is becoming very grave indeed. Firstly, we had that assassination of a Hamas official in Beirut, which was clearly a major provocation against Hezbollah, which is the effective power in control in Beirut. And we now see mounting pressure on Hezbollah to take action against Israel. And all of the attempts that have been made by various people to try to ease off the pressure in the Middle East, to de-escalate the conflict. I talked about the withdrawal of Israeli forces, the return to the United States of the Gerald Ford. We see, firstly, the assassination of this Hamas official in Beirut. Now, here I would say that at the Duran, we have been greatly privileged to have information about Hamas from somebody who actually knows this organization, who is Alistair Crook, and the former British diplomat who's familiar with all of these people in Israel, in Palestinian territories, in the Israeli government, in Hamas, in the Persian Gulf, wherever. And Alistair Crook has made the important point that there is now a clear difference between the military wing of Hamas, or I call them the military wing, the people who are running things for Hamas in Gaza, and the political leadership in Doha, and I suspect this person in Beirut. However important the Israelis and some people in the West think this person was, he probably had little actual influence on the actions being taken by Hamas in Gaza itself. His assassination will not have weakened Hamas militarily, but it was a huge provocation, primarily against Hezbollah, and it increases the prospect of a battle in the Middle East. And all of this happening in conjunction with that massive bomb attack near the tomb of Soleimani, time when General Soleimani's death was being commemorated in Iran. Hundreds of people killed in what was clearly a terrorist attack. There's a parcel game of responsibility. The United States says that they've no reason to think that Israel was involved. I gather Israelis say that it wasn't involved. There's all kinds of people suggesting that it was this country or that country, or the US or Israel involved. There's people referencing the MOK, a well-established anti-government group in Iran, which has conducted terrorist attacks of this nature in the past, but which I must say has had at least allies and probably sponsors in the United States as well. I'm not going to try and allocate specific responsibility for this attack. I don't know which country or party was responsible. All I will say is that I find it personally difficult to believe that the assassination in Beirut and this incident in Iran, this terrorist incident in Iran, are unconnected with each other. And now we've had this joint statement by the United States and several of its European allies, threatening, giving warnings, as they put it, against the Houthis in Yemen, suggesting that some kind of missile strike on the Houthis is imminent. And connected to the events in the Red Sea. And we see the pendulum constantly swinging backwards and forwards. So a few days ago, pullback of troops from Gaza, withdrawal of the Gerald Ford, suggestions, an appearance that things might be calming in the Middle East. And now the pushback, the assassination in Beirut, the bomb outrage in Iran, this latest warning, and we're back, or so it seems to me, to likely war scenarios. Let me repeat again, a point I've made many times. A general war in the Middle East is potentially a disaster. Already oil prices have spiked. Already more and more shippers are apparently pulling their ships out of the Red Sea. But if we start to have a general war in the Middle East at this particular time, well, all I will say is, given the trend of wars in the Middle East, ever since the United States began its attack on Iraq way back in 2003, given the fact that all of these wars have ended badly for the West and have ended in a further major weakening of Western influence, putting aside the enormous damage and death and misery that they cause. Why is there any desire in Western capitals to repeat that catastrophic formula? It shows once more that some people simply have no ability to learn lessons from what has happened in the past. There are diplomatic avenues that could be followed. The Russian ambassador to the UN, Vasily Nebenzia, has said that there is a direct connection between the events in the Red Sea and the events in Gaza. And he's obviously right. Get a ceasefire in Gaza. Follow it up with the release of hostages and perhaps also these prisoners that the Israelis are holding. Start some kind of negotiation and peace process there. Speak to the Iranians. Get them to call the Houthis off, which they probably can and would want to do. That is the correct diplomatic path towards stabilization. Assassinations, bomb attacks, and warnings of this kind are the exact opposite of what we should do. Well, I will no doubt be returning more to that topic in future programs. This is where I finish today's program. Just to repeat again, let me say once more that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Remember to check out our shop and find all the amazing things that you will find there. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day, and we'll see what happens both in Ukraine and the Middle East.